Dr. Atchison here, and we're going to be talking about classical conditioning, which is a kind of learning. So learning is really just any permanent change in behavior that's brought about by repeated experience. So if you really want to learn material in a classroom, just hearing it once rarely is sufficient. It's this repeated experience that really is helping you learn, and especially if you can learn and you can get that repeated experience in kind of different ways. You're getting that information in different ways. We see better learning, right? These aren't things that can be explained by innate or instinctive responses. Learning is not something that is innate, that just happens automatically. This is not something that instinct is going to give you this information or give you this behavior. It can't be explained by maturation. It's not just you get older and so all of a sudden you know this stuff. It has to be learned. When we talked about Piaget in our developmental chapter, we talked about one of the problems that he had with his stage theory is that a lot of people never got to that fourth stage, that really hypothetical, hypodeductive reasoning, because they weren't taught that. And he was kind of looking at it as this was more based on maturation. And it really ended up, that kind of thinking is based on learning. So there's two different kinds of learning that we're going to talk about in this chapter, one of which is associative learning. Associative learning is where we learn that two events go together. And there's going to be two different kinds that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, in this lecture, classical conditioning, which is a kind of associative learning, and we're going to talk about operant conditioning, which is also a kind of associative learning. We're going to wrap up this chapter with cognitive learning in our third lecture, and this is going to be a different kind of learning where we really are getting that mental information through observing, through watching others, and through language. So what you do in school is primarily cognitive language learning because you're getting this information through language. So while you're watching these classical conditioning slides, hopefully you're also engaging in cognitive learning. So learning really came out of an area of classical conditioning and operant conditioning really came out of an area of psychology called behaviorism. And this was the view that psychology should have been a really objective science. And this is something that we've held on to. So if you kind of looked at kind of the course of psychology as an area of study, there's been a pendulum swing one way or the other. Freud really, and we'll talk about him later, really looked at things as it was really about insight and introspection, and it wasn't about things that could be quantified. Behaviorists said, no, you're doing this all wrong. No, it should be only about things that should be quantified. And so behaviorism really took that pendulum swing really far the other direction in terms of the approach we have to psychology. Again, this objective science part of behaviorism is really the legacy of behaviorism is that we really do look at psychology this way now. Behaviorism itself studied behaviors alone, hence the name behaviorism, right? It wasn't interested in mental processes, where Freud was really interested in those and exclusively interested in mental processes. And he said that they were the reason for behavior. The behaviorists said, no, these are not, they looked at the behavior alone. And there are three big famous ones that we'll talk about. Primarily, we're going to talk about Ivan Pavlov in this chapter, and we'll talk about B.F. Skinner in our next in our next lecture. So again, this lecture, we're going to be talking about classical conditioning. It's a kind of associative learning. This was primarily done by John Watson and Ivan Pavlov. We're really going to focus on Pavlov. It really got, in terms of, because he was kind of the guy that discovered it. When we talk about classical conditioning as a whole, it was really refined into this, our understanding of it by John Watson. And classical conditioning is really about eliciting involuntary responses. So this is going to be some sort of natural response, some sort of innate behavior that the organism already has and already exhibits. What's going to happen though is it's going to be associated, that kind of behavior is going to be associated with an outside event. And so again, it's associative learning. In other lectures, we'll talk about operant conditioning and we'll talk about observational learning. But today, we're going to really focus on classical conditioning. So again, both classical conditioning and operant conditioning are kinds of associative learning. Classical conditioning is really making these associations between a conditioned stimulus, which is our CS, and an unconditioned stimulus, our US. And we'll pair those two things together. And that's going to create this situation where we have this reaction to the stimuli. So there's a stimuli that's going to create a reaction, right? If you see your favorite food, you have an unconditioned response to that. You kind of start to get hungry. You start to salivate. You're getting ready to eat because it's your favorite food. Those things are happening naturally all along. But what classical conditioning is saying is that we're pairing this kind of behavior, these unconditioned stimulus and this unconditioned response, this natural behavior, with something conditioned. We're going to pair it with something so that now we can get that same behavior with this conditioned stimulus instead. And in classical conditioning, the stimulus always precedes the response that elicits it. So we're always going to have those stimuli coming before the response. In operant conditioning, we'll see that that's backwards. It's going to be the opposite way. So in operant conditioning, the organisms associate their own behaviors with consequences. The stimulus follows the response. It follows that behavior, and it's going to strengthen that behavior. So again, we have kind of a difference in when that outside stimulus is happening in relation to the behavior. Classical conditioning, we're having the stimulus and then the behavior. In operant conditioning, we're having the behavior and then the stimulus. Actions that are followed by reinforcers are more likely to happen again, and actions that are followed by punishers are less likely to happen again. So again, classical conditioning is learning that's occurring when this association is made between a meaningful stimulus and a non-meaningful stimulus. This is where the pairing is happening. We're pairing these two things together. We're going to pair your favorite food with something that's meaningless, with something that's meaningful, and we'll pair those two things together and you'll get this response. As with a lot of science, this was found by serendipity, by accident. Ivan Pavlov was studying digestion in dogs, so not anything really psychologically related at all, and happened upon this idea, this associative learning. So we're going to real quick watch a video about that.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. a ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная! Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
So again, this was not what he set out to do. He set out to learn about digestion in dogs. And he stumbled upon classical conditioning. And you saw that at first it was a metronome, and then he switched it and did a bell, and he did music, and he did a light, and did all these different things. And every single time, he could get that conditioned response of salivation from this conditioned stimuli, which had previously been a meaningless stimuli. A light didn't mean anything to the dogs. It didn't do anything for the dogs. The bell didn't mean anything for the dogs. But by pairing it with something that did have meaning, the food, they were able to get that same response. So you kind of heard these terms already talked about a little bit, but let's kind of get them all out. Our unconditioned stimulus in this video was the dog food, okay? And this evokes an unconditioned response. This is what's already happening in nature, right? So dog sees the food, the dog starts to salivate. You see your favorite food, you start to salivate. This is not learned, this is automatic, this is just what's happening already in nature. This unconditioned stimulus and this unconditioned response. Where Pavlov says the learning is happening is in the pairing of this unconditioned stimulus, the dog food, and the conditioned stimulus, the bell, or the conditioned stimulus and the light, or the metronome, or whatever one of the examples he used. So he was previously a neutral stimulus. It used to not do anything, but by continually pairing the bell or the metronome or the light with the dog food, he was able to get the exact same salivation response, which then becomes the conditioned response. And so there wasn't food present, but the dog was still salivating like there was because of this conditioned stimulus relationship to that unconditioned stimulus. We were able to get that salivation without there being food present. So and this is what Pavlov thought was kind of the root of learning. And he said that this is what he thought was happening in nature. And that's because classical conditioning is really adaptive. It allows us to gain food. It allows us to avoid dangers. It allows us to locate mates. It allows us to produce offspring. When you hear thunder, you know lightning is nearby. And so you know that sound is a warning. And so you can use that information. When you, again, when the dog saw the light, they knew food was coming. That was adaptive. We'll see that it can be adaptive for locating mates and producing offspring as well. In an example that it has to do with quail. So again, the way classical conditioning works is the acquisition phase is where that neutral stimulus or that unconditioned stimulus are paired together. Okay, so where we're linking in this case, the bell that didn't mean anything to the dogs to the food that did mean something to the dogs. Linking those two together until we start to get that conditioned response. And then that bell doesn't become a neutral stimulus anymore. It becomes a conditioned stimulus that's eliciting that conditioned response. They've done this study, they've done recent research with quail at this, where they again did the light, and your book talks about this. They did the light to indicate when something was that the quail wanted were going to happen. In this case, it was when a lady quail was coming to the male quail's cage. They would do this light. And they would get an arousal response, obviously, from the quail when he saw the lady quail. However, they were able to condition this response and get that light to evoke the same response level, the same arousal level that they were able to do for just the quail alone. So again, this would kind of get the birds better prepared for mating, which is again giving them this reproductive edge. So this is classical conditioning. Acquisition is that first phase, is when that association is being made between those stimuli. Now, this only works as long as we keep those two stimuli paired. Extinction is when we start to lose that conditioned response because it's no longer being paired with that conditioned stimulus. So if you keep giving the dog the bell without giving the dog food, eventually the dog is going to stop salivating because he's learning that, hey, I'm not getting any food out of this. This bell does not mean I'm going to get fed, and they're no longer interested. And so we, again, will see this kind of weakening of that response, and that's extinction. Here in this graph, you can see when that conditioned stimulus is being presented alone, we see really a decrease in the strength of that conditioned response. Spontaneous recovery is when after a break, or after that extinguished response, we'll see a slight recovery, okay? So we get extinction, we're going down, and there's no longer an association between the conditioned response and the unconditioned stimulus. And the conditioned response, we're no longer getting this anymore. Take a break, a couple hours, a day, come back into that same setting, and all of a sudden you'll get a little bit of a bump in terms of that conditioned response. Does this still work? Does that light still mean I'm going to get a lady quail? Does that bell still mean I'm going to get food? So we'll see this kind of spontaneous recovery. All these examples we've talked about have been with animals, but it works with humans too. So when we lived in California, we had this wine chiller that had been given to us as a Christmas present, and it was just a sit on the table kind of wine chiller, and you put the bottle in, you pressed a button, and it would chill, and it would make a bell sound when it was done. Well, when we moved here to Georgia, we got a new dishwasher. That bell at the end was very, very similar to the bell on the wine chiller. So one night, my husband and I are watching TV in the living room, which is adjacent to our kitchen, and the bell goes off on the dishwasher. And my husband and I are both like, wine? Wait, there's wine? We weren't having wine. We weren't planning on having wine. But all of a sudden, that bell from our dishwasher was eliciting this conditioned response of wine. We wanted wine. We were all of a sudden interested in wine because we had paired those two things together, that bell with us going to be drinking wine. So we were kind of like Pavlov's dogs, only with wine. But because we no longer have that wine chiller, we stopped using it, so we got rid of it. Now when the dishwasher bings, nobody thinks anything about wine. That's been an extinction because we no longer pair that bing with wine. And so again, we've had an extinction of that. What we failed to do that day was discriminate between our conditioned stimulus and an irrelevant stimulus of the dishwasher bing. We were unable to discriminate between those two bells. And so we weren't able to tell the difference. Just like this snail here. He's saying, I don't care if she's a roll of a tape, I love her. He's having a problem with discriminating between those two things. So while it's completely normal and okay to be afraid of a lion in front of you, it would be not so adaptive to be scared of a kitten in front of you. While they're both kinds of cats, they're very different. And so that discrimination is important to be able to tell a difference between those things. We can also have this go the other way, where we can have stimulus generalization, where again, this is again what was happening with the wine. We had stimulus generalization. We had a conditioned response, our kind of salivation for wine, if you will, to a new stimulus, the dishwasher, that was similar to our original stimulus of the wine chiller. So again, we had this kind of response. One of the most famous ways that we've seen this stimulus generalization and we've seen classical conditioning in humans is a study that was done by John Watson called Little Albert. Now, this was done a very, very long time ago, and so now this would not be ethically okay to kind of create a fear in a small child, but this was a very, very long time ago before we kind of really had a better hand on research ethics. So we're going to real quick watch a video about this.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats.
See, he's okay with the dog, not concerned about the dog, wasn't concerned about the monkey, not scared of any of these different animals. They'll give him a white rat, it's completely fine. Holding the dog's paw, no fears at all. Here's the rat, not scared, really okay with these stimuli. These, right now, they're very neutral stimuli.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
So it's kind of hard to see in this video, but the baby is crying, is trying to get away, is very unhappy with these images, does not like it, sees trying to crawl away from Watson, was scared of the rabbit. So again, what we saw here was not only classical conditioning, where that really, really loud noise that scared Albert was being paired with these neutral stimulus, which became the conditioned stimulus of the white rat, but we're also seeing stimulus generalization, where he not only then was scared of white rats, but he was also scared of brown bunnies and small dogs and Watson in a white furry mask. So we saw stimulus generalization here as well. So that ends our conversation about classical conditioning.